The following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Tony D'Angelo's PM Coast to Coast. Now, here's your host, Tony D'Angelo.
Well, thanks once again, Mike DuBois, and good afternoon to you wherever you may be. My name is Tony D'Angelo. I am the host of Tony D'Angelo's PM Coast to Coast. This is my maiden voyage on the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. And this is an audio podcast show, and I'm really excited about this. For my first guest, I have a gentleman here who really I've just been wanting to talk to. His name is Frank Bucaro. He is an ethicist, a former theological student. He teaches ethics. And in a world which seems to be devoid of any kind of ethics whatsoever, and Frank, good afternoon, and thank you so much for being here.
Well, Tony, it's a pleasure. I'm glad to be here, and I'm glad to be among the first of your new list of programs.
Well, you know, and you're my leadoff hitter here, but I was in bed the other night, and I was having one of D'Angelo's famous 3 a.m. thoughts, and I was shaking my head, and I'm saying, what's not corrupted? You know, it's like it seems politics is corrupted, and sports is corrupted, and business is corrupted, and it's like, you know, help us all, you know, and I'm glad you're here. But what I like to do, as we spoke about, is I want to give you a question where you can identify yourself and you can tell our audience about who you are and how you come to be who you are. And I'm going to take you, I'm bringing you now to Pomfret, Connecticut, and I'm going to introduce you to my next door neighbor who's a Martian, who knows absolutely nothing about you. And my question to you, Frank, is who is Frank Bucaro, and how do you want to be introduced to my next door neighbor, and how do you want to be known to him? Who are you? What is your mission in life?
Oh, fair enough. Well, life is all about a journey, and as you alluded to, my first career is I taught moral theology and ethics for 18 years. So all of my training is in the theological vein. And then I decided to leave teaching, so I had to de-theologize my training, and I went into ethics when the first insider trading event happened in 1985. I've been doing this ever since. I think my goal in life is to be remembered as a good man. And as we look at decisions that are made, no matter what the industry is, there are always questionable approaches to looking at what is the ultimate good, and is it the common good? And in my mind, they're not being asked enough. So when I look at my career and my topics of ethics and value-based leadership, it's trying to get people to a moral compass understanding, a moral code that has, you know, a cause and effect in a positive way on our relationships, whether it be in our personal lives or our business lives, because you can't be ethical in one area of your life and unethical in another one. There has to be consistency, or it's not a valid approach. It's not deep enough innate within us if we decide when and how to be ethical. So when we look at that, it's been interesting in my career that unethical companies don't hire me. So it's those trying to do the right thing. It's those trying to bump it up a notch. It's those who have merged with other companies, a lot of mergers going on. It's those that want to revisit their value statement. It's, you know, wanting to work with their compliance department and teaching them the process of thinking ethically. I think there's a hunger out there. It's just that sometimes the corporate area gets confused between what's ethics and what's compliance, and they're intertwined sometimes, and I kind of help them undo the knot, to understand the difference between compliance and ethics and its impact on the workplace, and the individual person's department or division or whatever. So it's from CEO down to mid-level management is where a lot of my focus is with leadership, as to who do we look to, why do we look to them, and how do we know they're living out their values? What are the telltale signs? And so I work with them and give them ideas, techniques, and insights by which to stay true to the values of the organization as well as your own values from a personal sense as well.
Now, you've given me so much here to work with, and I believe my Martian neighbor is satisfied. He's gone back in into his flying saucer, but I liked what you said, even though I want to make sure I grasp this, when you said you de-theologized your thinking.
Yes.
Can you explain that, to a pea brain like me as to how that all worked?
Sure. As I mentioned, all of my advanced education is in theology. Well, I'm not sure God talk is still acceptable or ever was in the corporate world.
Mm-hmm.
So we can take the theological concepts and secularize them. Love your neighbor could be something like treat everybody with respect, disagree with behavior, but always affirm personhood. So that was a big shift for me. And so for all of my academic career studying theology and masters in theology, et cetera, how do I take these great principles and put them in business talk, so to speak? And it's working and has. They don't know it. That's what they're getting, and I'm not trying to convert anybody or anything, but let's put it within the context of how we treat people. What's really important in life? We're going to leave this life the way we came into it, with nothing.
That's right.
So what lessons are there for us in our family life and the corporate world about how we treat each other? It could be, are you making a sale or are you making a customer when it goes to sales ethics? Do you use authoritative power or authoritarian when you're a leader? And what are the results of each? How does it affect the worker, your kids, etc., depending on type of power that you embrace and choose, etc. So I'm making segues from the academic into the reality, into the workplace, and that's why when I do programs, I use family examples, business examples, personal examples, that if they don't get it one way, they'll get it in another way, but they'll get the message.
Now, I want to ask you also about compliance versus ethics. I think if you go to a lot of business enterprises, if you will, or professional sports teams, or colleges, or churches, or temples, or whatever the case may be, a lot of people will turn to you and say, well, what do you want with, what else can I do here? I'm keeping these rules they make me keep. And somehow I think in the statement I've just made, that's not ethics. And I know you can elaborate on that a whole lot better than I can.
Yeah, here's my analogy between compliance and ethics. One's an apple, one's an orange. They're both fruit. They're both good for you, but they're distinctly different. It's like another analogy. Those of us that wear glasses, compliance, one lens, ethics, another lens. You take out a lens, it affects your vision about where you're going. Compliance is only reactive. By the word itself, means you have to do what the law says. Ethics is only proactive. You have to choose to be ethical. No one ever goes to jail for lack of ethics. They'll go to jail for not being compliant or fined, whatever the case might be. So the battle that I face, if you will, at times is when I go to a company and I see the title Ethics and Compliance Officer. You cannot be an expert in both.
That's heavy.
Ethics is my expertise. I don't practice law. Compliance people have their hands full with the law, risk management, organizational development, etc. And my goal is to partner with them by saying, why don't you let me take that ethics part for you? And you and I will team up. So they see that ethics is the essence of the law and compliance is letter of the law. So I try to build that bridge. And part of that bridge is the definition of ethics that I use with them. And here's what I give them. Ethics is a tough decision with the payout at the end. And an unethical decision is the easy one and the payouts up front. You need to agonize, and I mean this in a positive sense. You need to agonize over an ethical decision. It cannot be made emotionally. It must be thought out, cause and effect, who will be affected, how will they be affected, does it go according to the values, the mission statement, etc.? How do we discern that best choice? Realizing with ethics, there are no guarantees, but the best decision is what needs to be worked on for the benefit of all.
Now, I'd like to give you a little bit of personal, shall we say, I don't know if you want to call it experience, but perspective. I still am, owning my own small firm, but when I was involved in bank trust operations and running tax departments and doing, shall we say, heavy compliance work years ago, and the then VP whom we had, who remains a friend to this day, would always tell me two things. He'd say, number one, what we do today, especially in a business like personal trust, where you make a relationship or you are named as a document in a fiduciary that does not become operated until 3 years later, those are things that you can't value. They're so intangible, but yet they will be tangible down the road. And the other thing he would say to me is, because of that, this business, which has really been historically quite true in my little pea-brain observation, will never, ever, ever, ever translate well into a publicly held corporation or a stock price, because it's not all about quarterly earnings, because a lot of what you may do that's very good may not show up for 2 years, 3 years, or whatever the case may be. And then in a quarterly earnings context, you have this one blockbuster quarter, and the management says, great, next quarter beat that by 5%, and it's just entirely impossible. I said all that to say this. When you're dealing with these, whatever you want to call it, financially driven business types, how do you sell to them that ethics is something not only that they must do, but this is not something that will dilute your bottom line, it will increase it?
Well, it goes back to the basic thing, is the goal to build a relationship, or is it more of a short-term goal of making
profits?
A sale,
Yeah, exactly.
or whatever the case might be, because those are two different approaches to looking at this. I always teach people about the moral spiral, and it's simply this. Every time you make a decision, it's like throwing a rock in a pond. No matter how big or how small that rock is, when that rock hits water, water's displaced. The bigger the rock, the bigger the ripples. My point is, times when we all make decisions that we think we know what all the results are going to be. And those are the ripples. And then sure enough, there's another ripple that pops up that now we're accountable for that we didn't see when we threw that rock or made that decision. And yet accountability has to be dealt with. And that goes back to what were the values that motivated you to throw that rock, and how will those values meet that unmet consequence? So for you to stay true to the values that you, or the values you personally, or that the company truly believe in. I do some work for USAA.
Mm-hmm.
And I sat in, when I was done with my session, I sat in with, at the time, the head general of the Army Corps of Engineers, and he came up with a process called Just Do It. And he said, answer these 4 questions yes, and then don't bother me. Just do it. And so when he talks about these things, you know, is what's going to be done, you know, part of our values system? Number 2, will the right thing be done for the customer? You know, type thing. Yeah, okay, values. Now I'm trying to think of the third one. Oh boy.
Well, you're making yourself quite clear. I understand.
And his last point is, are you willing to be held accountable for the decision?
Mm-hmm.
And he says, if you can answer these questions affirmatively, then don't bother me. Just do it. The key point is that last question, are you willing to be held personally accountable, is the one everybody chokes on. And that's why you have to look at this creatively and positively. And this takes time. He wants you to think about it before things happen. Because that's kind of the key about who we are and what we're all about, is a reflection of what we believe at that given moment in time.
Well, and you've hit on something, I think, with respect to my own question, where, you know, to somebody looking at numbers, it's more a case of your numbers will become entirely a whole lot worse if you're just flying blind and doing this thing and making it up as it goes along, you know.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I found it now. Okay, I got the other question. Here we go. Is it legal and ethical? Will the decision positively affect the customer? Does the decision reflect the values of the company? And are you willing to be held accountable for the decision? I think that's gold.
Oh, well, I do too.
To all of my programs.
Now let me ask you this, going back to the days of the insider trading and the Boskis and the Millikins, and coming to today and a lot of the things we see that it's almost like I get so blind busy, I lose track of time and space and everything else. But I said to my wife on Saturday night, you know, it's almost a blessing, because I don't sit there and dwell on what's happening in the news, and then I would become really scared. Tell me some of what's happening either up to the moment, or some of what you're seeing in politics and business and sports and you name it, as to where the ethical crises are.
Yeah, good question. You know, I think when we begin to look at these issues, there are a number of them. I think self-interest. I think ego takes precedence over positive self-esteem. Being ego-based, because that's a controlling issue. And the higher you up in the leadership, the better chance of the temptation to do that. Self-interest can morph into greed and selfishness. I think there is some, what I would call, stunted moral development beyond their own perception of what's important or what's real or whatever. We need to have behavior that's marked by fair dealing, acting in the best interest of the client. There's a lot of that going on in the healthcare industry. What's in the best interest of the patient?
Mm-hmm.
Lots of what's going on, because they're the ones that really, and their insurance companies, sign the checks, so to speak, for whatever's going to happen. I think we need to have a consistent application of ethical behavior. But here's the issue, and I fight this daily. Every company's got an issue for compliance training. Not everybody's got the investment moxie to do ethics training. Give you an example. I recently did an ethics training session for a government facility, so to speak. 20,000 employees at this every day. I went in to work with mid-level managers for a day on the process of thinking ethically. I asked the VP of compliance, how much do you spend here a year on compliance training? She said $100 million a year. I said, how much do you spend on ethics training for these people? She said, $500,000. My response to her was, what does that tell your people about the value and the importance of ethics? And I got silence. Everybody
I can see that.
Ethics is good business, but then what's the problem? I think compliance professionals are overloaded, and basically what they do is put an ethics module in their compliance training. Well, that's not going to do it. And so, where do we go? What resources do we have? I'm not sure online ethics training is really ethics. It's probably compliance training. As I look at some that I'm familiar with, the word ethics is rarely even put into that training module. It's all related or, pointing to compliance. And I understand the importance of compliance. However, if you say ethics is important, so where do we go from here? Because there are, as I see it, two main ethics issues in corporate America today. Number one, you now have 5 generations in the workplace at the same time. First time in American history.
I've never thought of it that way.
Millennials, and now Generation Z.
Mm-hmm.
So, you have 5 generations in the workplace, now you have 5 definitions of ethics. Now what are you going to do? Number 2, big issue. Not so much what's right versus wrong anymore, because that's pretty obvious. The real issue is in ethics, what do you do when it's right versus right? What do you do when you have 2 values you deeply believe in, and yet you must choose one? What's that process like? Compliance can't help you with that. Ethics training will. And so I see that all the time with my clients, trying to meet all that out, those 2 ethics issues, which needs ethics, training or whatever. But ethics training is seen as an expense rather than as an investment, by and large. And that tells you where the values are of the organization.
Well, yeah, and I mean, I see this as you're speaking on it as a case of I have a vehicle. It's an older vehicle. I maintain it. I change the oil. I make sure everything's okay on it. I want it to be safe. My state, like a lot of other states, driving on the highways and freeways is not a joy. So I look at this as a investment in my safety, because I don't want to end up worse coming off that ride than when I started it. And that's really what you're getting at is this really is defense. In sports, this is what keeps you from getting scored on, by changing the consciousness, if you will, of the people involved.
Yes. And what's interesting, the research of Generation Z, these digital natives, the youngest generation now in the workplace, there are 2 things research says they want out of their careers.
Well, this is the
youngest generation.
This is the
Ethical
generation.
behavior and respect.
This is the generation that watched the fall of humanity 10 years ago. You're absolutely right. So, yeah.
So, I mean, and there are, good things happening, all around us. There are those companies that obviously, do well because of ethics, et cetera. But then, you get the Volkswagen thing, or you get Wells Fargo, or you get GM with the ignition switch, or these banks that are getting $60 billion in fines.
Yes.
For, whatever, which they write off as just a way of doing business, the cost of doing business, I guess. Well, how do we justify, for example, Wells Fargo last week, there was an article, I posted it, their executives are getting pay raises after all the debacle of letting go 5,300 people and the fines that they're paying for false accounts and things like that. These people are still getting bonuses. What sense does that make to an ethical person, you see?
Well, and the other thing, I was talking with a colleague in the banking industry last week, and they've also been flagged on selling their own products where they are involved in a fiduciary relationship, which isn't exactly being fiduciary, and I think we both get the drift of that. It's terrible. One thing, as in our more or less as we start our descent, I know, like as we exchange on LinkedIn, I'm involved in a volunteer effort with a number of other people trying to get, shall we say, economic justice for a dwindling group of retired Major League Baseball players who, due to a whole bunch of things that really weren't good or right or decent, were shut out of pension and medical benefits going back to 1980. This is largely something where the league and the Players Association point at each other, and the Players Association doesn't want anything to do with it. Their current leader, Tony Clark, is anything but cooperative, and I hope he's listening. But it's just sort of, and meanwhile, we've got guys that can't pay their medical bills and are getting foreclosed on their houses. And now, if I said all that to say this, not to espouse my tales of personal frustration. If I go to baseball and I say, look, baseball, look at what you're doing. How dare you do this? And they look at me and they say, but look at all these wonderful family things we do, and we're about the family, and look at, we gave $10 million to the Hall of Fame. We're this, we're wonderful, we're America, we're magnificent. And Frank, the thing that jumps in my heart is this is coming right out of Public Relations Central, and that's what I want to focus on. I would imagine a lot of your headbutting would go on with the PR people who just want to put a spin on things and say everything's okay. Would you care to comment on that?
Yeah. Well, in their terminology, it would be, well, everything's in compliance.
You're absolutely right. You are absolutely right.
Just because you're compliant doesn't make it right.
Yeah.
I mean, you can be compliant and unethical as hell, and you will continue in your job. I mean, Wells Fargo, those that created the Great Recession, they're still on Wall Street. Why? What they did, according to the law, was okay. Was it immoral? Was it unethical? Absolutely. But where's the punishment for that? You see, there isn't any. So it's got to come from the inside as a values-based organization. If their values are money, then, people got to make a decision whether this is worth keeping that relationship, if that's all they're focused on, and what are they making their money on. For example, one of my clients is one of the pharmaceuticals who makes opioids. Well, that industry is under the gun.
Yeah.
not them alone, but, pharmacists and disreputable doctors and all kinds. I mean, there's the moral spiral I was talking about earlier, who affects. But now what do? Okay? Well, one pharmaceutical company slashed their sales force in half, decided to cut back on the amount and who gets, because some people need opioids, don't get me wrong,
sure,
for whatever their medical situation is. But they have made, because they changed CEOs, who's now an MD, they've cut back, they decided to restructure because they understand the danger. And they're also going to look at their relationships with pharmacies, doctors, etc., about over-prescribing, etc. There's another thing about the moral spiral, okay? But they're being proactive, okay, in doing this. Why? Because it's just not about the money, it's about people dying because of being addicted to opioids. That's a very, at times, scary move.
Yeah, for certain.
But this company needed to do it, and they're getting applauded for it in a lot of different circles. But it hurts the cost factor, cutting your sales, whatever. But yet, that's the difference between, the ultimate good or the common good versus, just what I think is right versus wrong type thing.
I hear you loud and clear. And in our closing moments together, I am a big, you can tell me a positive story or you can tell me a negative story. I like stories. Tell me something that sticks out in your mind where you had advised someone in the area of ethics or to behave ethically. And you don't have to mention names if you don't want to,
sure,
but where they took what you did and it saved them hell in a handbasket in an avenue, or they didn't and they faced the fire straight up. I just want you to give a good living example of this.
My fields are primarily in the pharmaceutical and financial industries.
Mm-hmm.
So I recently spoke to a pharmaceutical company. They wanted me to come in and do a session on ethics with their corporate staff. And then in the afternoon, I had their entire C-suite for 2 hours on ethical leadership and behavior. And a number of the principles I found out after I left that I had espoused and explained to them with techniques they put into practice shortly thereafter with very good results and response. And now we're talking about doing more work with them. Because my goal is, what's a good idea worth? And I learned a long time ago as a teacher, true education only happens when learning links up to people's experience. When I did my homework on that pharmaceutical company and their people and who's going to be in my audience, how I took my stuff and made it applicable in their experience that gave them a aha moment. Now, did they take everything? No. But they came in looking for a nugget. How can we make this better from a values perspective? How can we live our values of this company a little bit better than what we have in the past? How can we bump this up a notch and use it in creating a better customer relationship with our hospitals, with our pharmaceutical reps, with doctors, etc. And it's in those nuggets of giving them something to chew on that they can now take and mold and make it their own that will come up with a positive values-based decision and process. That's my goal. And that's what happened with that company.
It's, Frank, it has been an honor and a privilege to share with you today. As we go forward, we will, I'm sure, as we see them moment to moment almost, turn on your TV or your computer or punch in your car radio and some other thing is being spun out of control, we will be sure to have you back as things go on. But before we leave this podcast, I'd like everyone to know your contact information and where they can find you and what your activities will be.
Great, thank you. Yes, they can get a hold of me. My email is Frank Bucaro, that's Bucaro.com. They can call my office number at 630-483-2276 or link into me, because twice a week I do 2 what I call short shot articles on areas of ethics and leadership. And link into me and become a first connection, and you'll get those every week as well. I
read them. I enjoy them.
What a pleasure it's been for me to be with you, and I'm honored that you asked me to be part of this.
Well, listen, thanks so much, and we'll be winding out here in a second, and I got a little musical bump here. Hamilton, Joe, Frank, and Reynolds, 1971. Don't pull your love hat on me, baby. Frank, a pleasure to have you. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Tony.
Well, totally honored to have Frank Bucaro here. Totally honored that you guys found the time to listen to us. What a wonderful program we had. We'll be back with you real soon with more podcasts on Tony D'Angelo's PM Coast to Coast. And thanks so much for having some fun with us, and I really do appreciate it. Have a great week, everybody.